This is MS600 Lab1 Exercise 4. Now in this exercise, we're going to focus on how to protect an API that we write for our organization, protect it from other applications that might need access to them. Now to set the stage of what we're trying to build here, I want to consider here's an application whose job is to expose three APIs, X API, Y API, Z API, and they do different things respectively. Now these are hosted on the relying party. Okay, so this is the relying app. Let's call it the API app. Okay, so this API app will not implement its own identity and access management. So the API app is going to rely on Azure AD as the gatekeeper. So Azure AD as a identity platform can also support application development and application security. So in this scenario, we are going to have different types of apps. So let's define the different types of apps. The first kind is called a web app. Now, this is the type of app where a human, a user, will sign into the web app, and the web app will then invoke the API, perhaps on behalf of the user. Now, this type of permission, we describe them as delegate permission, in a sense that the user delegates the web app in order to invoke the API X. Another type of app is called native app. Okay. Now these native app may or may not may have, for example, an interactive user. Okay. Okay. Now these interactive user to this native app will perform similarly in the sense it may delegate the native app to access some data. Now, a third type of app would be a background service with non-interactive use. Now, in those type of scenario, the application themselves, these background service daemon type of app, carries their own identity and receive their own assignment. So in this type of application scenario, you will grant permission directly to the app, and the app must prove its identity to Azure AD, authenticate through Oauth2 means, okay, a certificate or an app secret. All right, so the application will autonomously, independently authenticate with Azure AD in order to authenticate into this directory system for the purpose of obtaining the bearer's token to invoke these APIs. So in these different types of workflow, Azure AD has to be aware of both sides of the security mechanism. So the API app must declare X, Y, and Z. So it must declare that I have these X, Y, Z API, and these are the permissions you need in order to invoke them. Okay. Now, just to take a little one step deeper, when the API permission is declared, okay, a permission can be consented, or a consent to the permission may be obtained either by user themselves, consent by user, or it can be consent by your directory admin. Now, naturally, at first you need to decide what is the sensitivity of this permission. If this permission is meant to access some user-owned data, for example, I am using this CRM, right? I want to see a list of my customer. Then perhaps I am the one to consent whether or not an application should be able to pull all my customers. On the other hand, there might be a permission that is granted to the application. Perhaps I have an audit application, and the purpose of audit application is to read every employees and their customer info so we can compile and find out if there are 2 or 3 representative all working on the same client. So perhaps this permission can be granted once by the administrator that can access organization-wide data. So generally, permission that relate to a specific user are consent by the resource owner, while things that is having the permission to read the entire directory users related data are typically consent by the admin. All right. Now, also, I want to ensure that we are okay with this concept: delegated permission versus application permission. Okay. Now, these two types of permission relates to the fact that with a delegated permission, there must be an interactive user of some sort that grant the permission, and the application themselves do not receive direct permission. The application is able to perform and invoke XYZ because it has been delegated either by the admin or by the resource owner. While an application permission, on the other hand, does not involve any user, the permission will be granted directly to the application. So imagine that I have a standalone app, a headless a kiosk at the lobby of a building. And the purpose of this kiosk is to search tenant and look for employees and tenant officers and workers within that building. Now, naturally, you have hundreds and thousands of people passing by the lobby of the building. They're not going to individually sign in to your app at all. They're just going to start typing names. So with those type of scenario, the application must be able to query the directory to find out a list of tenants. So we don't need users to interactively sign in and say, hey, act as me and do something. No, we just need to give application themselves that permission. Okay. Now, for this two type of application, they will be defined differently in Azure AD Portal. Okay. We will see both of these. Okay. Even though the lab instruction focus mostly on the delegate permissions, I will try to find some time to work its way into this exercise. Now, keep in mind, this lab exercise is going to focus on defining the permission either through the portal or the manifest, granting the permission through the Azure Portal GUI. Okay, we will stop before we build an app. For the subsequent app, we'll build a single page app that will make use of these delegated permissions. But for this exercise, we're going to primarily focus on understanding, number one, user's consent, admin consent. Both of those are delegated permissions. Now we also have application permissions. That's granting directly to the app themselves. While delegated permissions are, again, these are delegated by the user who has permissions to do so. Okay, so make sure you're clear with these two type of permissions and the use case of them. And they are used to protect the API that we're writing. Okay, by doing it in the Azure AD level as the token issuer, that means we can protect any app that is written to the Oauth2 standard, and any app that is able to handle Azure AD tokens. All right. Now, one last thing I'm going to introduce you to is scope and app roles. Okay. Now, the app roles can be used for application permission, while scope is defined for these delegated permissions. Okay, so those are the two keywords we're going to pay extra attention to when we make use of it. Now, strictly speaking, app roles can be used as not necessarily only for application. You'll see that you can define this for both application. You can put members to these app roles, both individual users, groups, or apps. But for this discussion, we're going to focus on applications. All right. So in previous lab, we have created a Contaso app. So let's navigate to Contaso app. Start with Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go to application registration. And this is all the applications that have been registered so far. So I'm going to click on Contaso app. Now, in the expose an API, this is where I would define scope. Once again, the scopes can be consent either by admin or admin and users both. Depends on the implication of this permission. All right, so here is where you can click on add a scope and add a name of the scope. Okay, so I'm going to show you one that has already been created. So this is a scope called employees.read.self. Now, typically, by convention, there are objects, verb, and whether it's all of those objects or just user's own data. So notice read.self, who can consent? So in this type of scenario, we can say admin can consent on behalf of the entire organization. So once the admin consents it, all the users effectively consent to it too. Or admins only. So this is reserved only for admins to consent to this delegated permissions. All right. So here we have some quick descriptions of what the user will see and what the admin will see, and make sure it's enabled. Now, anything you define here is similar, is actually translated to this manifest. So you'll notice there are two Oauth2 permissions, permission 1 and permission 2. So notice this is an admin only permission because this permission is meant for this app to read all employee information, while this Oauth2 permission is only to access individual records. So imagine behind this app, it has a database of all employee information, salesperson information, and so on and so forth. So that's what this application is going to check against. Okay, if an app is able to obtain the scope, as employees.read.self, this application will then go to the database and say, oh, this is obtained on behalf of Bob. So let me pull back all the Bob's records and display it. Now, someone that has this scope, employees.read.all, that makes a call, and my API checks it out. Yes, the caller has this scope. I will return all the employees' data. Okay, so this application declared two Oauth2 permissions. And these are going to be delegated permissions. Now let's say I'm going to build a front end that consumes this API. Okay, I will go ahead and go to default directory. And let's say I find this ASP.NET Core identity. I will navigate to API permissions. So let's say this is that kiosk application that anyone walk by and start typing employee and just get their extension office number. Okay, so I'm going to say this app needs to have access. And I'm going to look for my app, Contasso app. Okay. All right, so this is an app that will read all the employee information. All the employee information. And this is the delegate permission. Notice it is defined in the scope. Therefore, application permission is dimmed. I will define an app role in a moment. And then I'm going to use core identity, another app, to demonstrate what it means. So for now, I am assigning identity 01 to be able to read, to be able to obtain token representing the scope against the Contasso app. So I'm going to add that permission. So notice this is simply requesting a permission. It hasn't been granted yet. So as of right now, this app is unable to obtain permission to this scope. Azure AD will reject it until someone with that Azure AD permission, such as global admin or application admin or enterprise admin, okay, must consent to this. Now, an application can request multiple admin consented permission. As an admin, I have to decide whether this app is worthy of these permissions, and if it is, I will click that button and grant all of the permissions. Notice there is no individual granting. So it's not possible for me to say, out of the 5 things, I'm only going to give you 3 out of 5 instead of all 5. You can't do that because you're probably going to break the application in some ways. Okay, because chances are the application needs this to actually perform. But if you just cherry pick 3 out of 5 permission, the application may randomly break at certain parts that since we are not a developer, we don't want to be breaking application that way. So I'm going to click on grant. And once that's granted, it is all done. Any user who is working on this app, and this app can now read all employee information from Contasso app. So let's just walk through what's going to happen here. The ASP.NET Core Identity app has a list of static permissions. The things I configure here ahead of the time, these are called static permissions. So these application once signs in an interactive user, in the case of delegate permissions, can obtain a token to the scope. All right. So I'm going to add one more permissions. All right. So notice this application, once an interactive user signs on, and if this app intends to access Contasso app, now typically this involves a code authorization code grant workflow. All right. So in a sense that this app will request a token using an HTTP post along with the scope it intends to receive. And if the user has consented, okay, and this static permission is listed here. So in other words, the app is requesting that scope, and there is a signed in user, and the code will be granted to the web app. Okay, and the web app can then use that to obtain an access token. All right, so here's an example HTTP post that the application must make. Okay, so this will be the client ID of this app. Okay, so this client ID will represent that. The scope is our Contasso app declared scope. So that's what we're trying to access. And this is the authorization code. And if this is going to be authenticated through a client secret, then we provide the client secret right there to prove the web app. Now notice this is only required for web app because web apps consider a confidential app. So the confidential app has a way to keep something secure secretly. So we use that to identify the application's identity to prove that this is this web app. And what comes back will be access token. And that access token is used to invoke the Contasso app. All right. So there's that. These are delegated permissions. Now let's imagine I have another app called Identity Oauth2. And in this Identity Oauth2, I would rather grant permission directly to the application and then bypass any interactive users at all. So in that case, I'm going to go to Identity Oauth2. Okay. Now what you're going to notice is when I go to the API application and I'm trying to add one, the application permission is grayed out. So that's just so that you see it. Because I have not defined anything that can be obtained by the application. So to do that, I need app roles. Now this is the section of specifically this part. Okay, this is a section within your application manifest where you can define app roles. Now you'll notice that app role can allow either application, users, or both. So you can put application, user, or both. Okay. So for this lab, I want to demonstrate how to assign application permission because it goes hand in hand with the delegate permission. So it feels incomplete if we don't at least go through this app rules and application permission. Okay. So here, first I'm going to have to navigate back to the Contasso app to declare this app role. So I am going to the manifest directly, and there's a section called app roles, and here's an array. You can create objects within that array. Okay, and this is going to allow applications to obtain this, and I'm going to call this kiosk app. Now the ID, as long as it's GUID and it's unique, that's fine. Okay. Find office number by name. And I'm going to say direct office directory. Ooh. That's the description. So I'm going to call it kiosk app as well. Okay. For the value of this app. All right, so what this will do is we'll define a role within the Contasso app only. So by using an app role, I can now grant applications permissions. My API can then check against the caller, is this caller in this role? Okay, so this is relating to application permission. So I'm going to go back to default directory and I'm going to take this app, Identity Oauth2. I'm going to head over to API permission just like I did last time, and I'm going to add a permission to Contasso app. All right. So if I choose application permission, you'll see that there is now kiosk app, and that's what that looks like. And I'm going to say that's the permission, and I'm going to add that permission. Again, you have to grant consent for this app. Now, when you do this, that means Kiosk app can now communicate with Azure AD, the OAuth endpoint, which you'll find by going to app registration endpoints. So these are all the endpoint where you can interact with to obtain token, obtain consent. Okay, so these are the two things. Now, in this module, we'll focus primarily on how the application relies on Azure AD. Now, in the next module, lab number 2, we are going to change our focus into Graph API, which is one of the systems that Microsoft built to rely on Azure AD as the identity access management. So for now, just understand that what we're doing is not much different than how Azure builds the Graph API, of which all data in your Office 365, all data in your Azures are exposed through. So when you look at API permission, you'll find not only it can protect your application, it's been used to protect Microsoft's various services. Okay, so these are all varieties of Office 365 services. Now for the rest of the course, module 3, 4, 5, we'll be working with SharePoint, we'll be working with Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Offices, and they will, in one form or another, query, interact with a set of APIs.